Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me on. And It's always a privilege to talk to all of you. And I will do my best to give you just some broad strokes and then a little bit of deep dive. And then hopefully that sparks some conversation. I thought it might be interesting as we go through the kind of that base layer to kind of start really using that as an inspiration point for deep diving on things. And so, I wanted to start off with the definition of sound design. And I know it's kind of all encompassing, and in a way that is my gentle definition, which is the sound design to me is all of it. It's everything all together, right? Now, within our activity, we might be thinking that sound design is all of the electronic layer, and that's fine. And I think that that's a totally valid version of that argument. When I say I think it's all of it, it's everything is related to the other, right? And so, for example, I might write a snare part, but if it can't be realized visually, it doesn't really work. Or I might write this awesome visual move, but if it's not the right number of counts and it's this awesome thing for the tenors, but the snares are playing, well, then it doesn't really work. And so I think this falls into a similar category where, to me, the sound design is the marriage of the audio, both the acoustic and the electronic, together, along with the programmatic identity of any given moment, whether it's vertical, horizontal, or the whole program. And so I think thinking about that in that more holistic viewpoint, I think from your position, I can imagine how the sound design is really a way to talk about how the audio is related to the visual and how that all comes together and how that all creates the presentation that you want, right? And not thinking necessarily as just the isolated elements of the synths. And so as we do go into the isolated elements, we want to talk about those broad categories like the synths, right? So anything that is creating like melodic or harmonic or pitch-based ideas, right? Like harps and pianos and strings and that sort of thing. Then we have like sound design elements, right? Which is more kind of, for lack of a better word, like the Foley elements, right? Like the swish of the lightsaber, like all of the things that aren't necessarily melodic or harmonic or musical, but they do add to that musical texture, and they can either be very literal or they can be more abstract, and they can have more of a direction or presence or depth. And then I think specifically for our activity, I'd like to think about the third category, which is human voice, whether it's narrative or sung, because it's just its own kind of category in terms of how it's realized within our activity. So those are the kind of the three broad buckets I'm going to talk about, but taking into account that it's all relative to the context of the bigger musical and visual journey. The other things that I think that are worth understanding and having a good grasp on is just the gear that is required to pull off some of these moments and events in the show, right? So you have hardware, whether that's the actual synthesizers, the keyboards, the digital pianos, the basses, the guitars, the microphones, all of that stuff, the hardware. Then you have software, which a lot of groups now are using MainStage and using a computer and that sort of thing. So whatever software they're using, or plugins and sound libraries, all of that stuff that is that next layer. And then we have all of the speakers, everything that's delivering all of the audio that is being presented, right? And within each one of those elements, you can think about that just the way that, like, you might think about sticks or heads or mallets or the actual marimba, right? Like, they're all different contributors to the sound, and so there might be times when you're having that discussion with an ensemble, whether it's on the tape or in critique and that sort of thing, having a general identity about where your points of praise and your points of criticism are, right? Whether it's the hardware and the way that it's being delivered in terms of the quality, whether it's EQ balance, the speaker placements, that sort of thing, whether it's the quality of the sound of that cello patch or that sort of thing, that would be in software, right? And being able to talk gently about those different areas. I mean, those are the areas that we tend to have to live in to realize this element of the activity. The next thing, and I'm not going to go all the way down here, but I wanted to give you a little bit of philosophy. I think that our activity is extremely unique. I tend to think about sound design as it relates to like film and TV, right? Because it's just, I don't know if you've watched on YouTube, there's this really famous video with, at the end of Star Wars Episode 4, it's the throne room, right? When the medal ceremony. I don't know if anyone's seen that video where it's that scene without the music, right? And it's just like Chewbacca walking down and doing a roar, and everyone just stands there silently. Super awkward, right? So to me, the sound design is, in that moment, what we're missing is obviously John Williams' score, right? But if you watched any given movie and you're watching like a fight scene or a chase scene or any of those kind of scenes, or even simple scenes where there's a cat walking down the roof, there isn't necessarily a microphone picking up that audio. So if you're just looking at that video, you get no sound, right? So that has to be created after the fact. We all know this. I think that what is special about our activity is that we're taking those kind of elements, right? All of the Foley things, but we're also creating art out of them. They're not just background necessarily, but now they're part of the musical score. They're part of the musical texture. And this is where I think it makes it really special for us, because it's all happening in real time. It's being crafted and designed to be performed in real time. And this is where I feel like, I use this analogy of the literal to the abstract, right? Like turning that dial. Like there might be moments in someone's show where they're creating actual Foley sounds. And then you might turn that dial to the abstraction where they take the idea of heartbeats, right? And that whole idea of heartbeats becomes this musical abstraction that is blended into the soundtrack. And so I think it's really important to recognize that sound design as you're watching a show, and kind of even, I know all this happens in the background, but imagining how it's moving forward and backward in terms of its presence, but also how much it's moving left to right per se in terms of literal versus abstract, right? So I think those are two dimensions that you can have a discussion, or you can even just absorb things in, is whether you're thinking about forward to back in terms of presence and left to right in terms of literal versus abstract. And, I wanted to write out some different words that I resonated with me as I was thinking about sound design. And these are the kind of things that if I'm, as a designer, in a moment and crafting something, these are the kind of words that I might be thinking about as I'm trying to build a moment, right? And these can be also adjectives that that might be worth considering as you're talking on a tape, right? And you might think, okay, is the audio, the sound design, is it cohesive, immersive? Is it subtle? Is it overt? Can it be nuanced a little bit more, right? There's all these different terms that we would use in any other facet, whether it's music or visual, that you absolutely should be using as we're talking about sound design. And you don't necessarily have to be an expert at how a sound was created, but you can experience a moment and listen to it and ask yourself, any one of these different adjectives, is that coming across? Is that the intention? Is that how I'm receiving it? Right. And so these are just kind of some words that, we can talk about. One thing I notice, like stereo to mono, for example, that, a lot of groups will play with different effects, whether it's left to right, whether it's front to back. And a lot of times, there's opportunity within the stereo field even to manipulate sound, right? Like, for example, I could have a string sound and I could take it another layer and say, well, I might separate out the sound and put the violins on the left side of the stereo field and put the basses and the cello on the right side of the stereo field, so that when I'm experiencing it as an audience member, there's a width and immersion to the sound, right? And so there might be moments where you notice a sound happening on the floor, and don't be, afraid of talking about how the stereo image of that sound relates to what's happening visually on the floor, even, right? Like if there's an event happening on the left side of the field, side one, where's that effect of the audio that might need to be married to that? Is that coming out of the stereo mix? So little things like that. This next section I thought, is kind of a tongue in cheek kind of little brain dump here, but sometimes it's helpful to think about the opposite, and so I kind of use this as like a point of departure, but, so how to create bad sound design. Well, the first thing I thought of is it's like, if it hurts your ears, it's probably not what we want to be creating. I don't think any designer is saying, I want to hurt your ears. And so if there's moments in the show where something is really, really painful, we can still create the intent of that moment without having that, physical reaction to our ears. And, I'm just out of curiosity, how many of us have been to a drumline show and said, man, that's just too loud? I think probably all of us. And I think that is something that is possibly overlooked, not in terms of being called out, but in terms of like, how do we even address it? And it might, a lot of times I even have to remind myself that like, layering doesn't necessarily just mean adding. It means being intentional about what you're taking away, and I think that having that conversation with the units as things continue to develop over the season, it's really easy for a designer to be in that daily grind and just writing for that rehearsal, writing for that next rehearsal, writing for that next show. And sometimes we don't see the forest for the trees, and this is where when you sit and you watch 30 groups back to back, you start to see massive like areas where there is a redundancy in approach. And it's easy to watch 30 groups in a row and like, why does everyone keep messing up that same exact thing? Well, as a designer, sometimes you've got those horse blinders on so much that it's hard to like notice the bigger picture. And so, painful to the ears is definitely a massive test in terms of just quality that I think, for better or worse, I think that it's still left to be conquered by many groups. The second point is just adding random sound effects. I don't think this is as bad as it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And I am guilty of that too. When I stumbled across a sound library, like when I first got Voices of Passion by East West, and it was like, oh, look at all these awesome recorded vocal sounds. And then the next year, all of my shows had like, ethereal singing in them. And in that moment, I may not have thought, oh, well, is this right for the show? Because it was just a new toy that I was using. And I'm not sure if you experienced that, but in the past, as I've matured and developed, my ear tends to hear things in a way that I ask, why did you do that there? And I use the silly example of, we're not necessarily doing a space show, but all of a sudden there's like laser sounds happening. And it's like, oh, well, we're just trying to like do a crescendo into this moment. It's like, well, okay, that's fine. We can do that crescendo, but we're doing a show about the forest. Why is there a big laser sound here? And, I know that you may not say that necessarily on a tape, but I'm guessing that it is possible that you've experienced programs where there is this massively synthetic layer that maybe doesn't tell the story in a more human way than what is being perceived, right? Like the intent might be wanting it to be more organic and human, but you may not be receiving that as an audience member. And so I think, and in the blue on this article, I kind of put like some ways of talking about those moments, as a judge that you might experience. It's if you get to a point where like, I'm not really sure, like there's these sound effects in the show that have nothing to do with anything, you might be able to talk about the character of that, and I think that's totally valid. And I think the activity would be better to get that level of feedback from us. And then finally, the other word, the word that it was like really kind of came, I think I saw Mr. McIntosh here earlier, but this is a word that really came forward in the vernacular, about 10 years ago. And it is a good word to use, but I think it's also, I think we can take that next level forward. There's going to be a level of like with fidelity, there's going to be the groups that are struggling with distortion. And then there's going to be groups where things sound pretty good. And then there's going to be groups where it's just sounds seamless, and so our goal hopefully is to move people along that spectrum. And fidelity isn't necessarily just clarity, but it's also like depth and richness, and so, but being able to balance that within our venue is huge, right? So for example, if we listen to an audiobook, right? Like you listen to an audiobook or you watch a movie and you hear James Earl Jones's voice, there's going to be a richness and a depth and just a grit to that. You put that on a floor and try to do that within the context of what we're doing, that bass frequency just might be overbearing and it might be completely washing out any level of clarity that we want to experience. And so that might be an instance where some strategic EQing out of the low end and a little bit of boosting of the highs might be a conversation worth having with that ensemble, right? And so being able to speak to that EQ, right? Knowing about lows and mids and highs and being able to say, hey, in this room or in this moment, you have this beautifully sung vocal line, but the vibe frequencies are right in the same exact high mids as the vocals, right? And so it might be nice. You might consider how you're going to blend those two elements, right? Or there might be a marimba voice that is right in the thick of a piano voice that's happening at the same time, the same mids and the lows that are being created, and they're playing unison and they're just kind of stumbling on top of each other. Being able to speak about the fidelity and the EQ of the sound, both from the synthetic and the acoustic, it comes back to that marriage. There's going to be a level where the sound design could be fantastic, but then the sound reinforcement might be lacking, and then the other way around, right? And so being able to talk about how to potentially marry the two to be a more effective musical presentation, I think that that's worth exploring the vocabulary for that. I apologize if it's kind of a free flow of conversation. I want it to be a little more structured. If you want to read the document, hopefully you get a little bit more of a structured presentation. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is just creativity in general. This is tricky because creativity, it's something that we all aspire to in every measure, every single note, every single step. It is something that is that holy grail. And it is one of those things where sometimes more is not more, right? And well, much of the time more is not more. And so this kind of goes back to the random sounds all over the place, right? Creativity isn't necessarily just taking every single preset on Omnisphere and making sure that I'm using that in the show. Creativity actually might be, I'm only going to use this one preset, and that's the only one I'm going to use. And so how can we encourage and reward and think about creativity the way that we would, you can see a creative visual moment and you know that what it took for them to do that, or have a singularity of thought, or have a singularity of vision, all of those kind of ideas, we can think of that with singularity of sound design as well, right? Like the way that a certain vocal is treated. You might have, for example, the same word repeated over and over, but there might be different levels of inflection. There might be different levels of treatment with EQ, with reverb, with panning, with whisper, with excitement, with presentation, with placement on the floor. And so being able to reward that creative use of simple elements, I think that that is also another area that may be overlooked. We're just thinking about sound design as this thing that just happens over the top of the show, but just the way that you use motivic development, whether it's visual or musical, that also can be used on the sound design level. And then the other thing with creativity is I would look at is whenever you see or hear something where you're like, I wonder how they made that happen, or I wonder how they got the sound to do that, or I wonder how this moment was created and they took this sound and it was, I saw them like pluck a guitar string, but then all of a sudden the sound morphed into like this low bass tone. Things like that where that make you think, I wonder. To me, those I wonders are potential rabbit holes to chase for creativity that you might be able to reward, if you see a moment where it makes you as just a human, a designer, as a judge, feel like, I wonder, how did they do that? I would say that that is a nice indicator of a potentially creative moment that could be rewarded. And then finally, I just wanted to kind of end with, actually, I have two more bullet points here. The first is the low hanging fruit, which is vocals, synths, sound design, right? What are the different areas that we can talk to ensembles about these sorts of things when they come up? So with vocals, we have quality, right? What is the quality and the inflection of the narrated vocal? And, I think sometimes we take that for granted, but delivery, just tone, rasp, enunciation, lack of enunciation, inflection, dynamic, all of the things that the human voice is capable of doing to capture someone's interest and to communicate. Are those happening, or are they cared for, right? When you hear a program and you hear a line delivered, does it feel cared for? Clarity, right? That's a big thing. Like rule number one of indoor percussion is don't have vocals and percussion all at the same time. That's a rule that gets broken a lot. I break it all the time. And, there's intentionality behind that because a vocal can deliver more than just words, right? A vocal can deliver direction. It can deliver pitch. It can deliver harmony. It can deliver nuance and emotion and feeling. And so being able to recognize not just that words are the only intention, right? So there's a couple different areas there that are worth mentioning. And that doesn't mean that if you hear a vocal and it's not clear and it creates confusion, that doesn't mean that that's not worth talking through. I think it's just having awareness for, there are times where that isn't the only intention for example, a lyric. The synth voice, I think, low hanging fruit here usually is blend and balance with synths, right? Like how does the low end blend in a room? How, are the mid frequencies of synths, are those muddying up a moment? Are they adding bolstering and creating texture and depth? For me, the synth and sound design element is, we've all got marimbas, we've all got bells, snares, tenors, cymbals, bass drums, all of those sounds. For the most part, everyone has those textures and they're all within the same identity. So the synth and sound design is really where a group gets a chance to have a unique sound signature, have a unique identity and presentation, right? And so when it comes to the synths and the sound design, I think one thing to really reward and encourage people about are, what are you doing to be unique? What are you doing to enhance musicality? What are you doing to create a sound? This is your one opportunity to have sounds that no one else has. What are we doing to push that envelope a little bit? And when people do push that envelope, are you able to recognize that? Yeah, so I talked about uniqueness. Oh, and then really another big one with the sound design is the visual enhancement. How does it tell the visual story, right? If you have a panning sound that goes from left to right, but everyone on the floor is moving right to left, there's an incongruency. Now, you might want to do that for, ironic purposes, and that's totally fine. But I think more times than not, you want that to be pretty married, right? Like, I think we all agree that when we watch old, Godzilla films and the sound and the voice are all off, it's funny. I don't know if that is the intended effect, right? And so that's kind of an example of this, where we might want irony, but most of the time we don't. The visual enhancement thing is a big one as well, because it's, the same way that with percussion, most everything that we do has like a very clear transient and a decay. And with sound design, we have an opportunity to do the opposite, right? We have the opportunity to not start with the transient. And so a lot of the times we'll use sound design to create pad or to create direction or to create decay, and being able to recognize how those are all enhancing both the musical score and the visual score, using the directionality of sound design. And then the final question, this is a thing that Chris brought up in his email that he asked me about, which is sound design across the different paradigms. And I thought about this a long time, and we have conversations on steering committee about classification all the time. And we talk about, how much does the program factor into classification decisions, and so my first instinct was, good is good, music is music. By that, what I mean is, sound design doesn't necessarily have a quantity threshold across classes. I could even argue that if I was writing an A-class show, that show might actually have significantly more sound design than a world-class show, because I'm using that sound design as a tool for the arena, for the size of my ensemble, to carry that room, to carry presence in a more appropriate way. Instead of trying to fill that room by bashing a bass drum, I might use the low end a little bit more in an A-class group than I might use in an independent world group, that there's plenty of acoustic sound pressure level happening, and sound design, just the reality is with density, like the density of notes that you have at the world-class level, sound design becomes a little bit more of a valued commodity, right? Because the more you have it in the show, it just is more on more on more on more. Whereas with the lower classes, the sound design, I think, has a much more utility for creativity, for identity, for effect, musical effect, for character, for emotive quality, right? An A-class ensemble may not be able to get that largeness of moment just through the sheer prowess of their students, right? But this is where sound design can really help and bolster. So for me personally, I'm not sure that I have like, oh, well, you have A-class sound design and you have open class sound design and you have world-class sound design. But I think that you can talk about those things when it comes to the execution, right? The same way that you might hear a really mature group play a buzz roll versus a beginning ensemble playing a buzz roll, or a really advanced group doing a crab step at 60 beats a minute is going to look totally different than a beginning ensemble. And same thing here is you can have really sophisticated sound design, but if the delivery and the balance and the fidelity and the painfulness on the ears and the like the blend of the sound design versus the marimbas, the blend, the way that the sound design doesn't necessarily line up with the visual. All those different elements, I think, now start to apply when you're talking across paradigms and talking about understanding and maturity and presentation. So if I was going to approach having those conversations with ensembles, whether it's in critique or on tapes, then I would really focus on the execution of the sound design in terms of class expectations. And then when you can talk about, creativity, you can talk about implementation and effect, all of those things. To me, those transcend the different class paradigms. And then just at the bottom, I've got a couple different videos here that you can watch on your own leisure as you see fit. I found a couple videos that are really cool talking about sound design process and, what it means to do sound design. This last video is really, really cool about Foley and just like the art of it and the creativity of it. And, it gives you a really awesome appreciation for what it takes to imagine a sound and then make it appear that didn't exist before, and in a way, I think that that's what's special about sound design is nothing exists. You have an idea, you do some work on your computer, and now the sound exists. And so can we credit and appreciate that thing that people created, and how does it hit us? How does it affect us? How does this help the program? How does it support the other performers? And so, yeah, there's my presentation.